Marcus Johnson walked through the busy airport with his black leather briefcase in one hand and his phone in the other. He was a tall man with kind eyes and a warm smile that made people feel comfortable around him. At 35 years old, Marcus had learned many things about life, but the most important lesson was to always dress well when traveling. He wore his best navy blue suit, a crisp white shirt, and polished black shoes that clicked softly on the airport floor. The morning sun streamed through the large windows of Denver International Airport, creating long shadows across the terminal. Marcus checked his watch and saw that he had plenty of time before his flight to Miami. He had made this trip many times before, but today felt different somehow. Maybe it was because he was excited about the work waiting for him in Florida, or maybe it was just the beautiful weather that put him in a good mood. Marcus worked for the United States government as a federal auditor. His job was very important, though most people did not know what he did for a living. He worked for the Department of Transportation, which meant he helped make sure that airlines, buses, and trains treated all passengers fairly. When people complained that they were treated badly because of their race or color, Marcus was one of the people who investigated those complaints. His briefcase was full of files and documents about different cases he was working on. Some were about airlines that charged different prices to different people. Others were about bus companies that made some passengers sit in worse seats. Marcus had seen many sad stories in his work, but he also had the power to help fix these problems. That is what made his job so meaningful to him. As he walked toward his gate, Marcus thought about the case he was going to work on in Miami. A family had complained that an airline treated them very badly during a flight last month. The family said that the flight attendants were rude to them and ignored their requests for help. They believed this happened because they were black, and Marcus was going to Miami to investigate their complaint. The airport was full of people from all walks of life. Business travelers hurried past with their rolling suitcases. Families with children moved more slowly, parents carrying bags and snacks, while little ones held tight to their hands. Marcus enjoyed watching people at airports because everyone had somewhere important to go, and everyone had their own story. Marcus stopped at a coffee shop to buy his usual morning drink, a large black coffee with 1 sugar. The young woman behind the counter smiled at him and asked how his day was going. Marcus always tried to be friendly to service workers because he knew their jobs could be difficult. He left a good tip and thanked her for the excellent service. While walking to his gate, Marcus pulled out his boarding pass to check his seat assignment one more time. Seat 2A in first class. The government had booked him in the premium cabin because his trip was long and his position was senior level. Marcus had flown first class many times for work, but he never took it for granted. He knew that many people never got the chance to fly in such comfort. He also knew that sometimes other passengers would look at him with surprise when they saw him in first class. Some people seemed to think that a black man did not belong in the expensive seats. Marcus had learned to ignore these looks and focus on his work instead. He was proud of his job and the education that had gotten him there. As Marcus approached his gate, he saw that boarding had not started yet. He found a quiet seat where he could review his files one more time before the flight. He opened his briefcase and pulled out a folder marked confidential. Inside were documents about several cases he was working on, including the Miami case that was the reason for this trip. Marcus did not know that in just a few minutes he would become part of a story that would change everything. He did not know that today he would experience exactly the kind of discrimination that he spent his days investigating. He simply sat in his chair, drinking his coffee and reading his files, preparing for what he thought would be just another business trip. The announcement came over the loudspeaker that his flight was ready for boarding. Marcus closed his briefcase, finished his coffee, and stood up. He straightened his tie and walked toward the gate agent, ready to show his boarding pass and begin his journey to Miami. He had no idea that the next few hours would test everything he believed about fairness and justice in America. Marcus walked up to the check-in counter with confidence, his boarding pass held firmly in his right hand. The gate area was busy with travelers getting ready to board the plane. Children were running around while their parents gathered bags and checked tickets. Business people typed on their phones and laptops, trying to finish work before takeoff. The normal sounds of airport life filled the air around him. Behind the counter stood a woman who looked to be in her 40s. Her name tag read Karen, and she had blonde hair pulled back in a tight bun. She wore the standard airline uniform, a blue blazer with the company logo on the chest. When Marcus approached her counter, she was organizing papers and barely looked up at first. Marcus placed his boarding pass on the counter and smiled politely. "Good morning. I'm ready to board when you are." Karen picked up the boarding pass, and her expression changed immediately. Her eyes widened as she read the seat assignment. She looked at the ticket, then at Marcus, then back at the ticket again. Her face showed complete surprise, as if she could not believe what she was seeing. "Sir, I think there might be some kind of mistake here," Karen said slowly, holding the boarding pass up to the light as if checking to see if it was real. "This ticket shows seat 2A in first class. Are you absolutely sure this is your ticket?" Marcus felt a familiar feeling in his stomach. It was the same feeling he got when he read complaint letters from people who had been treated unfairly. He had experienced this type of questioning before, but it still bothered him every time it happened. "Yes, ma'am, that is definitely my seat," Marcus replied calmly. "Marcus Johnson, seat 2A. The reservation was made by my office 3 days ago." Karen continued to stare at the boarding pass as if it might change before her eyes. She turned it over and examined the back, then held it up to the light again. Other passengers in line behind Marcus were starting to notice the delay. Some checked their watches and shifted their weight from foot to foot, clearly getting impatient. "Let me just double-check this in our computer system," Karen said, though her tone suggested she believed there was definitely an error. She typed on her keyboard for much longer than necessary, clicking and scrolling through screens. Marcus could see her computer screen, and his reservation was clearly displayed with all the correct information. Marcus reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out his government identification card. "Here is my ID if you need to verify my identity," he offered politely. He had learned that being cooperative and calm usually helped in these situations, even when he felt frustrated inside. Karen took his ID and studied it carefully. She read every word on the card, front and back. When she saw that he worked for the federal government, her expression became even more confused. She seemed unable to understand how a black man could have both a government job and a first-class airplane ticket. "I'm going to need to call my supervisor over," Karen announced loudly enough for other passengers to hear. "We need to make sure everything is correct before we can process this." Marcus nodded patiently, though inside he was taking mental notes of everything that was happening. As a federal auditor who investigated discrimination complaints, he knew exactly what was going on. He had read hundreds of similar stories in complaint files that crossed his desk. The difference was that now he was living through it himself instead of just reading about it. The line behind Marcus was getting longer. A well-dressed white businessman tapped his foot and checked his expensive watch. A family with young children looked tired and anxious to get on the plane. Everyone was waiting because of the delay that Karen had created over his perfectly valid ticket. Karen walked away from the counter to find her supervisor, leaving Marcus standing there with his boarding pass and ID still in her hands. He could feel the stares of other passengers, some curious and others annoyed. Marcus took a deep breath and reminded himself to stay calm and professional, just like he did at work every day. Karen returned with her supervisor, a tall man with gray hair and a serious expression. His name tag read David Mitchell, and he walked with the authority of someone who had worked for the airline for many years. He looked at Marcus with cold eyes, as if Marcus had already done something wrong just by standing at the counter. "What seems to be the problem here?" David asked Karen, though he was looking directly at Marcus when he spoke. "This gentleman has a first-class ticket, but I want to make sure it's legitimate," Karen explained, handing David the boarding pass and ID. "Something just doesn't seem right about it." David examined the documents with the same suspicious look that Karen had shown. He held the boarding pass up to the light, checked the ID against Marcus's face multiple times, and even called someone on his phone to verify the reservation. Meanwhile, Marcus stood quietly, watching other first-class passengers walk past the counter without any questions at all. A white businessman in an expensive suit approached the counter next to Marcus. The gate agent there smiled warmly and processed his first-class boarding pass in less than 30 seconds. The man was welcomed aboard and wished a pleasant flight. Marcus watched this happen while David continued to examine his identical documents with intense suspicion. "Sir, we're going to need you to step aside while we sort this out," David said, pointing to a corner area away from the main counter. "We have other passengers to help, and this is taking longer than expected." Marcus felt his face grow warm with embarrassment, but he moved to where David pointed. From his new position, he could see everything that happened at the counter. 3 more first-class passengers checked in quickly and easily. None of them were asked to show additional identification. None of them were questioned about their tickets. None of them were asked to step aside. During the 20 minutes Marcus waited, he watched David and Karen help dozens of passengers. They smiled at white travelers and processed their requests quickly. They made jokes with some passengers and offered helpful suggestions about gate changes and flight delays. But whenever they looked in Marcus's direction, their faces became serious and unfriendly. Marcus quietly reached into his jacket pocket and turned on a small recording device that he always carried for work. As a federal auditor, he had learned to document everything that might be important later. He also sent a text message to his supervisor at the Department of Transportation, letting her know that he was experiencing a situation that might require investigation. A young black woman approached the counter with her family. Marcus watched as David questioned her ticket more carefully than he had questioned any white passenger. He asked her several times if she was sure she had booked the correct flight. He made her spell her name 3 times and asked to see additional identification. The woman looked confused and embarrassed, just like Marcus felt. An elderly white couple walked up to check in for first class. David greeted them with a big smile and asked about their vacation plans. He processed their boarding passes quickly and wished them a wonderful trip. The difference in treatment was so obvious that other passengers in line began to notice and whisper to each other. Marcus saw a middle-aged black businessman approach the counter. David immediately became suspicious again, examining the man's ticket carefully and asking multiple questions about his reservation. The pattern was clear to anyone who was paying attention. White passengers were welcomed and processed quickly. Black passengers were questioned and delayed. After 20 minutes of waiting, Marcus approached the counter again. "Excuse me, but have you finished verifying my reservation? I would like to board the plane now." David looked annoyed that Marcus had spoken up. "We're still working on it. These things take time when there are questions about the booking." Marcus knew there were no real questions about his booking. His reservation was valid. His payment had been processed, and his government office had made similar bookings hundreds of times before. The only question was the color of his skin. Karen returned to the counter after another long phone call. She had been gone for 10 minutes, supposedly checking Marcus's reservation with the airline's main office. Marcus had watched her through the glass window of the supervisor's office, and he could see that she had spent most of the time talking to David rather than making any phone calls. "Sir, I have some news about your situation," Karen said with a fake smile that did not reach her eyes. "It seems there has been a small problem with your reservation. Your first-class seat has been accidentally double-booked, and we had to give it to another passenger who checked in earlier." Marcus felt his heart rate increase, but he kept his voice calm and steady. "That's impossible. I checked in online yesterday and confirmed my seat. My reservation has been active for 3 days. I understand your frustration," Karen continued, though her tone suggested she did not care about his feelings at all. "But these things happen sometimes with our computer system. The good news is that we have a solution for you." She pulled out a new boarding pass and placed it on the counter. Marcus could see that it showed a middle seat in the last row of the economy section. It was the worst possible seat on the entire airplane, squeezed between two other passengers with no window view and no room to work. "We can offer you this seat at no additional charge," Karen said proudly, as if she was doing him a huge favor. "Plus, we will give you a full refund of your first-class upgrade fee and a $50 voucher that you can use on your next flight with us." Marcus picked up the new boarding pass and looked at it carefully. "This is a middle seat in the back of the plane. My original reservation was for seat 2A in first class. I did not pay an upgrade fee because my government office booked this ticket directly. I'm sorry, but this is the best we can do," Karen replied with a shrug. "The other passenger has already boarded the plane and is settled in your original seat. We cannot ask him to move now." Marcus looked toward the gate and could see that boarding had not even started yet. The gate agent was still organizing papers and setting up equipment. No passengers had boarded the plane because it was still 30 minutes before the scheduled boarding time. Karen was clearly lying about another passenger already being in his seat. "I would like to speak with your manager," Marcus said politely but firmly. "This situation is not acceptable, and I believe there has been a mistake." David appeared at the counter as if he had been listening to the entire conversation. "I am the manager on duty, and Karen has explained the situation correctly. We have a seat available for you in economy class, plus compensation for the inconvenience. This is a very fair offer." Marcus noticed that David's voice had become louder, and other passengers were starting to stare at them. Some people pulled out their phones and began recording the conversation. Marcus realized that David was trying to create a scene to make him look like a difficult customer. "I have a confirmed reservation for first class," Marcus repeated calmly. "I work for the federal government, and my office made this booking through proper channels. I should not have to accept a downgrade because of your computer error." "Look, we're trying to help you here," David said with obvious irritation. "You can take the economy seat and the compensation, or you can find another flight. Those are your only options." A security guard appeared next to David, though Marcus had not seen anyone call for security. The guard was a large man with a serious expression, and his presence was clearly meant to intimidate Marcus into accepting the unfair offer. "Is there a problem here?" the security guard asked, looking directly at Marcus as if he was the source of any trouble. "This gentleman is being difficult about his seating assignment," David explained to the guard. "We've offered him alternatives, but he refuses to be reasonable." Marcus felt the eyes of dozens of passengers watching the scene unfold. Some looked sympathetic, understanding that he was being treated unfairly. Others seemed to assume that he must have done something wrong to attract the attention of security. An older white woman approached David with her first-class boarding pass. He immediately smiled at her and processed her ticket in less than 15 seconds, welcoming her aboard with warm wishes for a pleasant flight. The contrast with Marcus's treatment could not have been more obvious. Marcus realized that he was at a crossroads. He could accept the humiliating downgrade and file a complaint later, or he could stand up for his rights and risk missing his flight entirely. As a federal auditor who investigated these exact situations, he knew that backing down would only encourage more discrimination. David Mitchell stepped closer to Marcus, his face showing clear anger and frustration. The security guard moved to stand beside him, creating an intimidating presence that was meant to pressure Marcus into giving up his fight for fair treatment. Other passengers had stopped what they were doing to watch the confrontation unfold. "Let me make something very clear to you," David said in a voice loud enough for everyone nearby to hear. "We have been more than patient with this situation. We have offered you a perfectly good seat and compensation for any inconvenience. If you continue to be difficult, we will have to consider other options." Marcus remained calm, though his heart was beating faster. "I am not being difficult. I am simply asking for the seat that I paid for and reserved 3 days ago. This seems like a reasonable request." "Reasonable," David laughed coldly. What seems unreasonable is someone trying to claim a first-class seat when there are questions about how that ticket was obtained. We have procedures to follow when something doesn't look right. The words hit Marcus like a punch to the stomach. David was suggesting that he had somehow stolen or fraudulently obtained his ticket. It was an accusation that Marcus had heard about in discrimination complaints, but experiencing it personally felt much worse than reading about it in a file. "Are you suggesting that I obtained my ticket illegally?" Marcus asked, his voice still controlled but showing the first signs of the anger he was feeling inside. "I'm not suggesting anything," David replied with a smirk. "I'm just saying that when something looks suspicious, we have to investigate it properly. Maybe you should be grateful that we're offering you any seat at all instead of calling airport police." The threat was clear and direct. David was telling Marcus that he could either accept the economy seat quietly or face arrest. It was exactly the kind of intimidation tactic that Marcus had read about in dozens of complaint letters from other travelers who had faced discrimination. Marcus noticed that several passengers were now openly recording the conversation with their phones. A young white woman shook her head in disgust at what she was witnessing. An elderly black man nodded at Marcus with understanding, clearly recognizing the situation for what it was. "You people always want to cause problems," David muttered under his breath, but loud enough for Marcus and several other passengers to hear clearly. The racist comment hung in the air like a toxic cloud. Several passengers gasped audibly, and Marcus saw shocked expressions on faces throughout the gate area. David had just revealed his true feelings about black passengers, confirming what Marcus had suspected from the beginning. Marcus reached into his pocket and made sure his recording device was still running. As a federal auditor, he knew that David's comment was exactly the kind of evidence that could prove discrimination in court. He also knew that staying calm and professional would serve him better than responding with anger. "I would like to speak with the airport manager," Marcus said clearly. "This situation has gone beyond a simple seating issue, and I believe we need higher-level management to resolve it." David's face turned red with anger. "I am the highest-level management you're going to get, and I'm telling you for the last time that you need to take the economy seat we're offering or leave this gate area immediately." The security guard stepped forward and placed his hand on his radio. "Sir, I'm going to have to ask you to make a decision quickly. Take the seat they're offering, or we'll need to escort you out of the airport." Marcus looked around the gate area and saw that he had supporters among the other passengers. Several people were shaking their heads at the unfair treatment he was receiving. A businessman in a suit approached the counter. "Excuse me," the businessman said to David. "I have a first-class seat, and I would be happy to trade with this gentleman if it would help resolve this situation." David immediately became friendly toward the white businessman. "That's very kind of you, sir, but it's not necessary. We have everything under control here." Another passenger, a middle-aged woman, also offered to give up her first-class seat for Marcus. Then a young couple joined in, saying they would be willing to help however they could. Marcus was touched by their kindness, but he knew that accepting their help would not solve the bigger problem. "I appreciate everyone's generous offers," Marcus said loudly enough for all the passengers to hear. "But this is not about one seat on one flight. This is about fair treatment for all passengers, regardless of their race or appearance." Within 10 minutes, 2 airport police officers arrived at the gate. Officer Rodriguez was a Hispanic man in his 40s who walked with confidence and professionalism. Officer Williams was a younger black woman who immediately assessed the situation with sharp, intelligent eyes. Both officers wore the standard airport police uniform and carried themselves with the authority of experienced law enforcement. The gate area had become crowded with curious passengers who wanted to see what would happen next. Some people were still recording with their phones, while others whispered quietly among themselves about the obvious discrimination they had witnessed. The tension in the air was thick enough to cut with a knife. "What seems to be the problem here?" Officer Rodriguez asked, looking first at David and then at Marcus. David immediately launched into his version of events, speaking quickly and trying to control the narrative. "This man is refusing to accept his seat assignment and causing a disturbance. We've been trying to help him, but he won't listen to reason. He's holding up the entire flight." Officer Williams looked at Marcus with professional interest. "Sir, can I see your identification and boarding pass?" Marcus handed over his documents calmly. Unlike David and Karen, Officer Williams examined them quickly and efficiently. She looked at his government ID with recognition and respect, clearly understanding that Marcus was a federal employee with legitimate travel documents. "Your ticket shows seat 2A in first class," Officer Williams said to David. "Can you explain why this passenger can't use his assigned seat?" David stammered for a moment, realizing that his story about double booking and computer errors would not hold up under police questioning. Well, there were some questions about the legitimacy of the reservation. "We have to be careful about fraudulent tickets." Officer Rodriguez raised his eyebrows. "What specifically made you think this ticket was fraudulent?" "The passenger has valid government identification and a properly issued boarding pass." Karen tried to help David by jumping into the conversation. "Sometimes our computer system flags certain reservations for additional verification. It's just standard procedure." Officer Williams looked directly at Karen with skepticism. "Ma'am, I've been working airport security for 8 years. I know what standard procedure looks like. And this isn't it. Can you show me the computer alert that flagged this reservation?" Karen's face turned red as she realized she could not produce any evidence of a computer alert because none existed. She looked at David for help, but he was busy trying to avoid eye contact with the police officers. Marcus decided it was time to reveal his true identity. He spoke quietly to Officer Rodriguez so that David and Karen could not hear him clearly. "Officer, I need to show you something in private. I work as a federal auditor for the Department of Transportation, and I investigate discrimination complaints against airlines." Officer Rodriguez's expression changed immediately as he understood the significance of what Marcus was telling him. He walked a few steps away from David and Karen, gesturing for Marcus to follow him. Marcus showed him his federal credentials and explained that he was experiencing exactly the kind of discrimination that he investigated in his professional work. "This is a very serious situation," Officer Rodriguez said quietly. "Are you officially investigating this airline, or is this personal travel?" "This was supposed to be personal travel for a work assignment," Marcus explained. "But now it's become evidence of the discrimination patterns I study every day. I've been recording everything that happened." Officer Williams joined the private conversation, and Marcus explained the situation to her as well. Both officers immediately understood that they were dealing with a federal civil rights case, not just a simple airline dispute. Officer Rodriguez returned to David with a much more serious expression. "Sir, this gentleman has a legitimate ticket for first class, valid government identification, and proper documentation for his travel. On what legal basis are you refusing to honor his reservation?" David realized that the police officers were not going to support his discrimination. His voice became defensive and angry. "Look, we have the right to refuse service to any passenger we feel might cause problems. This man has been argumentative and disruptive." "I've been standing here for 30 minutes, Marcus said calmly. "I have not raised my voice, used inappropriate language, or made any threats. I have simply asked to use the seat that I paid for and reserved." Officer Williams looked around the gate area at the other passengers. Did anyone here witness this man being disruptive or argumentative? Several passengers immediately spoke up to defend Marcus. The businessmen who had offered to trade seats said that Marcus had been nothing but polite and professional. The woman who had offered her seat agreed that Marcus had done nothing wrong. Even passengers who had not been directly involved said that they had seen obvious discrimination taking place. Officer Rodriguez made notes in his report book as passengers gave their statements. Officer Williams took photos of Marcus's boarding pass and identification. Both officers were clearly treating this as a serious incident that would require detailed documentation. David realized that his plan to intimidate Marcus had completely backfired. Instead of a quiet removal from the airport, He now faced a formal police investigation with multiple witnesses supporting Marcus's version of events. With two police officers clearly supporting Marcus's right to his assigned seat, David and Karen found themselves in an impossible position. They could no longer claim that his ticket was fraudulent or that he was being disruptive. The evidence was overwhelming that Marcus had done nothing wrong and deserved to board the plane in his first-class seat. Officer Rodriguez spoke directly to David with authority that could not be ignored. This passenger has valid documentation for seat 2A in first class. You will honor his reservation immediately, or I will file a formal complaint with the airport authority and the Department of Transportation. David's face showed defeat and anger, but he knew he had no choice. He took Marcus's boarding pass and began processing it through the computer system, though he made every keystroke seem like a personal insult. Karen stood beside him with a sour expression, clearly unhappy that their discrimination had been exposed and stopped. "Fine," David said through gritted teeth. "We'll honor the original reservation. But I want it noted in our records that this passenger has been difficult and uncooperative." Officer Williams immediately stepped forward. "Actually, sir, our report will show that this passenger has been professional and patient throughout this entire incident. The difficulty and lack of cooperation came from airline staff who refused to follow proper procedures." As David reluctantly processed Marcus's boarding pass, he made several announcements over the gate speaker system. "Ladies and gentlemen, we apologize for the delay in boarding. We experienced some passenger issues that required additional verification procedures." Marcus noticed how David was still trying to make him look like the problem, even though everyone in the gate area had witnessed the discrimination firsthand. Several passengers shook their heads in disgust at David's continued attempts to blame Marcus for the delay. When boarding finally began, David made sure that Marcus's experience would be as unpleasant as possible. He checked Marcus's identification 3 additional times, even though the police officers had already verified. He made Marcus stand aside while he processed several other passengers first, claiming he needed to double-check the computer system. As Marcus finally walked down the jet bridge toward the plane, he could feel the stares of other first-class passengers who had witnessed part of the gate incident. Some looked at him with sympathy and support, understanding that he had been treated unfairly. Others seemed suspicious, as if they believed he must have done something to deserve the treatment he received. The lead flight attendant, a woman named Jennifer, greeted Marcus with obvious coldness when he boarded the plane. Her smile was fake and her voice was strained, as if speaking to him required great effort. She looked at his boarding pass as if she had never seen a first-class ticket before. "Seat 2A, Jennifer said with barely hidden annoyance. "Right this way." As Marcus walked to his seat, he noticed that Jennifer had warmly welcomed every other first-class passenger with genuine smiles and friendly conversation. She had asked about their destinations, offered to hang up their coats, and made sure they were comfortable. But her treatment of Marcus was mechanical and unfriendly. Marcus settled into his seat and pulled out his phone to send a message to his supervisor at the Department of Transportation. He needed to report what had happened and begin the process of filing an official complaint. As he typed, he could hear Jennifer talking to other passengers around him. She offered champagne to the passenger in seat 1A, asking if he preferred red or white wine with his meal. She helped the woman in seat 3B store her carry-on bag and complimented her on her beautiful scarf. She asked the man across the aisle about his business trip and recommended restaurants in Miami. When Jennifer finally approached Marcus, her entire demeanor changed. Her voice became flat and professional, without any of the warmth she had shown other passengers. "Would you like something to drink?" she asked, without making eye contact. "I'll have orange juice, please," Marcus replied politely. Jennifer nodded curtly and moved on to the next passenger, immediately returning to her friendly and engaging personality. Marcus watched as she brought drinks to everyone else first, taking extra time to chat and make sure they were satisfied with their service. When Jennifer finally brought Marcus his orange juice, she set it down without a word and turned away immediately. He noticed that his glass was smaller than the drinks served to other passengers, and she had not offered him the warm nuts or other snacks that everyone else received. During the flight, Marcus continued to document the differential treatment he received. His meal was noticeably smaller than those served to nearby passengers. When he asked for a second cup of coffee, Jennifer acted as if his request was an unreasonable burden. She responded to his questions with short, unfriendly answers while engaging other passengers in pleasant conversation. Marcus realized that the discrimination he had faced at the gate was continuing on the airplane itself. The airline staff seemed determined to make his flight as unpleasant as possible, even though he had done nothing wrong, and the police had confirmed his right to be there. As the plane flew toward Miami, Marcus reviewed the recordings he had made and the notes he had taken. He had more than enough evidence to file a comprehensive discrimination complaint, but he also knew that this was bigger than just one bad experience. This was a pattern of behavior that needed to be investigated and stopped. As soon as Marcus's plane landed in Miami, he pulled out his phone and made several important calls. His first call was to his direct supervisor, Sarah Chen, who was the Director of Civil Rights Enforcement at the Department of Transportation. Sarah had worked with Marcus for 5 years and knew that he was not someone who would exaggerate or make false claims about discrimination. "Marcus, tell me exactly what happened from the beginning," Sarah said, her voice showing both concern and professional interest. Marcus spent 20 minutes describing every detail of his experience, from the initial questioning at the gate to the continued poor treatment during the flight. Sarah took detailed notes and asked specific questions about the timeline, the names of airline employees, and the witness statements from other passengers. "This is exactly the kind of systematic discrimination we've been looking for," Sarah told him. "Your case gives us a perfect opportunity to investigate this airline's practices with someone who has first-hand experience and professional training in civil rights law." Within 2 hours of Marcus landing in Miami, Sarah had contacted the Department of Transportation's Office of Inspector General. The Inspector General's office was responsible for investigating serious violations of federal civil rights laws, and Marcus's case had all the elements they needed to launch a major investigation. By the end of the day, federal investigators were reviewing security camera footage from Denver International Airport. They wanted to see exactly how Marcus had been treated compared to other passengers, and they wanted to document the obvious differences in service that he had described in his report. The investigators also requested all computer records related to Marcus's reservation and boarding pass. They wanted to prove that there had never been any legitimate questions about his ticket and that the airline's claims about computer errors and double booking were completely false. Sarah contacted the passengers who had witnessed Marcus's treatment and offered to support Marcus during the incident. Several people agreed to provide official statements about what they had seen. The businessman who had offered to trade seats said he would be happy to testify about the discrimination he had witnessed. Within a week, the investigation had expanded far beyond Marcus's individual case. Federal auditors began reviewing hundreds of discrimination complaints that had been filed against the same airline over the past 3 years. They found a clear pattern of black passengers being questioned more thoroughly, seated in worse locations, and treated with less respect than white passengers. The investigators discovered internal emails between airline employees that contained racist language and jokes about black passengers. They found training materials that instructed gate agents to pay extra attention to passengers who didn't look like they belonged in first class. They uncovered policies that were designed to make discrimination look like standard business procedures. Marcus worked closely with the federal investigation team, using his expertise as a civil rights auditor to help them understand the legal implications of what they were finding. His unique position as both a victim and an investigator gave the case a level of credibility and detail that most discrimination cases lacked. The airline's executives initially tried to dismiss Marcus's complaint as an isolated incident involving a few bad employees. They claimed that David Mitchell and Karen had acted against company policy and would be disciplined appropriately. But the federal investigation quickly proved that the discrimination was systematic and widespread. Phone records showed that David had called his supervisor during Marcus's gate experience, and his supervisor had encouraged him to continue questioning Marcus's right to the first-class seat. Email records showed that this same supervisor had sent similar instructions to other gate agents when dealing with black passengers in premium cabins. The investigation revealed that the airline had a secret policy of flagging reservations made by passengers with traditionally black names for additional verification. They also found evidence that black passengers were routinely moved to worse seats even when they had confirmed reservations for better locations. Marcus's recording of David's racist comment became a crucial piece of evidence that proved the airline's discriminatory intent. Legal experts said that having such clear audio evidence of racial bias would make the case much stronger in court and would likely result in significant financial penalties for the airline. The Department of Transportation also began investigating other airlines to see if similar discrimination patterns existed throughout the industry. Marcus's case had opened the door to a much larger examination of civil rights violations in commercial aviation. News media began reporting on the investigation after federal prosecutors filed formal charges against the airline. Marcus's story became a symbol of the everyday discrimination that black travelers faced, and his unique background as a federal auditor made the case even more compelling to the public. Civil rights organizations praised Marcus for his courage in standing up to discrimination and for his professional handling of a personally difficult situation. They said his case proved that discrimination was still a serious problem in America, and that strong federal enforcement was necessary to protect everyone's rights. The airline's stock price began falling as investors worried about the financial impact of the federal investigation and the negative publicity surrounding Marcus's case. 6 months after Marcus's discriminatory treatment at Denver International Airport, the federal investigation reached its conclusion. The Department of Transportation announced that the airline would face the largest civil rights penalty in aviation history. The company agreed to pay $15 million in fines and settlements, with a significant portion going to Marcus and other passengers who had experienced similar discrimination. The settlement required the airline to completely overhaul its customer service training programs. Every employee who interacted with passengers would have to complete 40 hours of civil rights training and pass a comprehensive exam about fair treatment policies. The training would be repeated annually, and employees who failed to meet the standards would be terminated immediately. David Mitchell was fired from his job and banned from working in the airline industry. Karen also lost her position and faced personal lawsuits from several passengers who had been discriminated against during her time as a gate agent. The airline's executives who had encouraged discriminatory practices were removed from their positions and faced federal criminal charges. The airline was required to implement new computer systems that would flag any unusual delays or questioning of passengers based on their race or ethnicity. Federal monitors would review these reports monthly to ensure that discrimination was not continuing under different methods. Any pattern of bias would result in additional penalties and possible criminal prosecution. Marcus's case led to new federal regulations that applied to all airlines operating in the United States. The Department of Transportation created specific guidelines about how passengers must be treated during check-in and boarding processes. Airlines that violated these guidelines would face immediate investigation and significant financial penalties. The new regulations required airlines to document and report any passenger complaints related to discrimination. They also established an independent review board that would investigate serious civil rights violations and recommend punishment for companies that engaged in systematic bias. Marcus decided to share his story publicly through television interviews and congressional testimony. He wanted other victims of discrimination to understand their rights and to know that federal agencies were serious about enforcing civil rights laws. His articulate and professional presentation of the facts made him an effective spokesperson for fair treatment in transportation. Congress invited Marcus to testify at hearings about discrimination in the airline industry. His first-hand experience as both a victim and a federal investigator provided lawmakers with unique insights into how bias operated in commercial aviation. his recommendations became part of new federal legislation that strengthened passenger rights and increased penalties for discrimination. The case received national media attention and sparked conversations about racism in many industries beyond aviation. Civil rights leaders praised Marcus for his courage and professionalism, saying that his case proved that discrimination still existed and required continued vigilance to combat. Marcus received awards from several civil rights organizations for his role in exposing systematic discrimination and fighting for equal treatment. He was promoted to a senior position at the Department of Transportation, where he now leads a team of investigators who specialize in transportation civil rights cases. The airline industry as a whole began implementing stronger anti-discrimination policies after seeing the severe consequences that Marcus's case had brought to his airline. Companies realized that the financial and public relations costs of discrimination were too high to ignore, and they began investing in better training and oversight systems. Marcus continued his work as a federal auditor, but his experience gave him even deeper understanding of the discrimination that ordinary citizens faced every day. He became a leading expert on civil rights enforcement and frequently spoke at conferences and training sessions for other investigators. The case established important legal precedents that made it easier for future discrimination victims to seek justice. Courts could now point to Marcus's case as an example of how systematic bias operated and what kind of evidence was needed to prove civil rights violations. 5 years after the incident, Marcus reflected on how one difficult day at the airport had led to meaningful changes that protected thousands of other travelers. He knew that discrimination had not been eliminated completely, but he was proud that his experience had made the transportation system fairer for everyone. Marcus's story became a case study in business schools and law schools across the country. Students learned about the importance of civil rights enforcement and the role that individual courage could play in creating systematic change. Today, Marcus continues his work protecting the rights of travelers while serving as an inspiration to others who face discrimination. His case proved that one person standing up for justice could create changes that benefited millions of people and made America a more fair and equal society for everyone.